Welcome to The Art of Medicine, the program that explores the arts, business, and clinical aspects of the practice of medicine. I'm your host, Dr. Andrew Wilner. Today, I'm excited to speak with Daniel Barvin. My good friend, Dr. Michael Weisberg, introduced me to Dan. Mike is a very busy gastroenterologist and writer. He has 2 novels now, and a nonfiction book is in the works. You can watch Mike's interview on this program, episode number 14. My guest, Daniel Barvin, is the Vice President of Operations and Patient Advocacy at Coya Therapeutics, a new company that hopes to find treatments for neurodegenerative diseases, including ALS and dementia. Daniel is also co-founder of End the Legacy, a nonprofit supporting individuals at risk of genetic ALS and their families. I'm going to let Daniel tell his fascinating story in just a minute. But first, I'd like to thank our sponsor, locumstory.com. Maybe you're curious about locums and how it might fit into your career story, but you know all the different reasons physicians choose locums and how it works for them? At locumstory.com, you can hear firsthand stories as diverse as physicians themselves. There's not one solution for everyone. The variety of opportunities might surprise you. Locum Story is an unbiased educational resource. It has tools that let you explore trends in your specialty and compare different locums agencies. There's even a simple quiz to see if locums is right for you. Do your own research at locumstory.com. It's easy. And now to my guest. Welcome, Daniel Barvin.
Thank you, Dr. Wilner. It's an absolute pleasure to be on the podcast. I want to thank Dr. Michael Weisberg for putting us in touch. I think we're going to have a thrilling conversation and looking forward to sharing all the experiences I've had with the listeners.
All right, so let's start. ALS and dementia, not really fun topics. So how did a guy like you get involved in this?
Well, unfortunately, I was kind of thrust into it. As a very young person, at the age of about 8, I lost my grandfather to what we thought was Alzheimer's. And this wasn't so abnormal. People of that age tend to get dementia. However, his eldest son, my uncle, was diagnosed with ALS about a few days after his passing. This was abnormal. My family had never seen any instance of ALS before, and we were truly shocked and blown away by how devastating the disease was. Sadly, in 2 years, he would pass, and shortly after, my father would develop early onset dementia at about 45. The doctors couldn't give us a diagnosis, and they just said the best we can do is continue to live our lives. This was, incredibly frustrating as a teenager trying to go through life, figuring out my own path and experiencing my father's illness, and not having anyone or anywhere to turn. After college and kind of going through his experience, I returned home and we got news that my aunt in Philly was diagnosed with ALS. All of this disease was just so confounding for me. And again, we just lost that brutal, brutal battle. No doctors ever mentioned that any of these diseases might be related or that my own future might follow their footsteps. So again, just more confusion, fear, and unknown. And then finally, and incredibly sadly, my father would pass away in 2016 of an unknown dementia. All of this came to a head about 6 months after I got married, when a genetic test came back for my father, indicating that he carried the C9orf72 genetic variant, a causative variant for either ALS and or FTD, frontotemporal dementia. So this was a big shock for me, and understanding finally that all of the disease that my family had experienced was hereditary. It spurred me in so many ways, the knowledge that my future was now likely to mimic theirs. And it showed me that the path that I had been on of having no resources, of having nowhere to turn, was not one that I wanted anyone else to experience. I had the opportunity to tell my story to a local high school and really just had this incredibly monumental moment of feeling like I could share my story with the world, that people cared about my story. And I knew from that day on that my future would be intertwined with the advocacy space. Um, from that point on, I kind of made it my life's mission to create resources and advocacy for the genetic ALS and FTD community, which we now know to be in the population size of about 500,000 of those either who carry a genetic mutation for ALS or FTD in the US and millions globally. These numbers far outweigh those who actually are symptomatic with these diseases. And in 2018, when I found out that I had carried the mutation, there were no organizations focused on creating resources or advocacy or awareness for that community. And so I put it on myself to stand up and tell my story and engage with other patients to say, we will not let what has happened to our parents, to our loved ones, happen to us. And that was the creation of End the Legacy.
Wow. So growing up, you must have thought, gee, this is just incredibly bad luck. My grandfather, my uncle, my aunt, my father. And then, somewhere finally a bell went off in some doctor's mind that, gee, this could be a gene, right? This isn't just incredible. I mean, what's the lottery here, right? Your family keeps winning the lottery
Right.
of these nasty diseases. Now, does everyone who carries the gene develop the disease, or there's some who do, or how does that work?
Sure, I can give some insight on the penetrance. When I found out in 2018, they had ideas, the penetrance for C9 or for 72 were somewhere in the 90th percentile. The idea that if you have this genetic variant, you have extremely high risk of developing disease in your lifetime. Through work of End the Legacy, we have engaged with researchers to redo those studies. And now with more data, we believe that in actuality, uh, penetrance may be somewhere in the 30 to 40% range, which is hopeful. However, if I look back at my family history, um, 3 siblings had this genetic variant, 3 siblings got disease. So it's hard to equate my anecdotal evidence with the scientific data, right? Um,
Sure, although, it's often that way because the people who didn't develop disease might be off the radar, unless you go hunting for them. Whereas the people who develop disease, right, they kind of rise to the top. So, it might even be lower than that once everybody, once they do some big epidemiologic study and just take all comers, there might be people living perfectly normal lives who happen to be carriers.
That is the hope, and we hope to find those people and understand what is actually protecting them from the
Hmm.
genetic variant, reaching that tipping point and turning into disease, right? We know that there are downstream effects from the variant that are building up oxidative stress. What is it that is keeping those people whom are not turning into symptomatic patients from reaching that tipping point? And that's something that researchers are very focused upon. So if you find anyone, let
Right.
us
And
know.
so I have a couple things. First, I want to step back. Once that test was available, there must have been some decision making that you had to go through. In other words, do I really want to know? Tell me about that.
Sure. So one, the genetic mutations in the ALS space are fairly new discoveries. The first ever discovered was SOD1, SOD1 in about 2006. C9orf72 was discovered in 2012, which is why it's very alarming that my father passed in 2016 without any understanding that this might be a hereditary link, right? I think 4 years would be enough time to get this uh, new data and information out to doctors, but apparently not. So I had just gotten married. My wife and I were, in the most thrilling time of our young lives. We wanted to start a family, and then this news hit us. It was very fortunate that we were put in touch with a genetic counselor soon after finding out that I was at risk. And the genetic counselor started off with, incredibly poor news. Look, there's a 50% chance that this autosomal dominant variant has been passed on to me. If you carry it, there's a 90% chance you'll develop disease. Oi, oi, oi. But we can do family planning.
Mm.
And they told us about IVF and PGT, pre-genetic testing, and how we, through IVF and PGT, could ensure that the embryos that we implant do not have my genetic mutation. And for me and my wife, that was truly this shining star of hope that we had, that we could end this hereditary disease in its tracks. I changed my view from my life is what's important to I can now change the future for the next generation. And that changed my entire mindset about, will I get tested? It's no longer about me, right? It's about, what can I do for the next generation? And we now have two beautiful children, Kai and Hannah, 3 and 1.5, who are not at risk of this genetic mutation. And that means the absolute world to me. And so, I think in a disease state which has no opportunity for intervention at the moment, and we'll talk about Coya and its hopeful ability to have intervention in these diseases, but with no possible therapies or what to do, especially as a pre-symptomatic individual, right? Besides just having that knowledge, what can I really do day to day? Not much. Knowing that I'm able to end that disease, that was enough for me. And so that made the decision easy.
For those who are listening who don't have medical backgrounds, I think everybody's familiar with dementia, and that's sort of a one-way street. It just gets worse and worse. But ALS, the average survival, and I've done a program here on ALS, but the average survival, even with the state-of-the-art medical care, is 3 years. And, if you live a long time with ALS, it's 5. Now, and of course, it can be shorter, as your uncle. And there are new treatments coming out for ALS. It's a long way from a cure. There's a lot of excitement in the ALS field right now, but it's still a really nasty diagnosis to get. So we're not talking about, I might have this, minor genetic defect. This is serious business, dementia and an ALS gene. So
Yes.
how are we going to fix it?
Well, one, go back to your comment on the severity of ALS and why it's been such a confounding issue for pharmaceutical companies. It's a very heterogeneous disease. You have people whom are living for 2 years, some who live 10 years, 15 years. So the time it takes for these symptoms to really degrade are heterogeneous. And a lot of the companies have been looking at single modality therapies. How do we look at fixing the mitochondrial effects of the motor neuron? And, really those treatments have not been successful. We have one FDA-approved therapy, which maybe extends life by 3 to 6 months. That's not enough. You are still being told by your doctor to prepare your will. This is going to be the end. Coya Therapeutics, the company that I joined as the first employee back in 2021, was built on the scientific discovery of Dr. Stanley Appel that all neurodegenerative disease drives an inflammatory response. And eventually that inflammation rises to such a level that it not only starts continuing to kill off damaged motor neurons, but eventually it damages what are called regulatory T cells, the most important immunomodulating cell in the body. And once regulatory T cells are damaged, inflammation becomes a persistent condition, driving degeneration and eventually death. What Coya has done is developed a combination biologic, on one hand, low-dose IL-2 that has been utilized in cancer in high dose. We have the only low dose formulation, and abatacept, um, which is used to reduce inflammation. And what we've shown is that we can stop progression of this disease over 48 weeks in a small cohort of patients with incredible safety. And we are now pushing that, taking that data and moving forward into a phase 2 double-blind placebo-controlled trial that will start enrolling in the next few months. And what we are truly hopeful for is that ALS is a orphan disease, a disease of high unmet need, and because of the incredible power of the advocates in the ALS space, the FDA has been very this is a bit contentious at the moment because Amylyx just had a failure on their phase 2 approval. The FDA has approved in the past phase drugs in ALS off a phase 2. They may have to step that back as Amylyx just failed their phase 3 confirmatory study, and so the first case of doing so was not necessarily successful. But we are very hopeful that this will allow us to bring our therapy to patients much faster than we otherwise would have.
Right. The FDA does have a special pathway for what you mentioned accurately as orphan diseases, meaning that not everybody gets them. Diabetes, there's a lot of people out there you can get into clinical trials. ALS, yeah, it happens, and the people affected are affected severely, but it's hard to get a whole bunch of them together and do a clinical trial. So they're willing to not bend the rules, but they do have a separate set of criteria to make it easier to study this group. And ALS certainly fits in there. So I wish you the best of luck with phase 2. While researching for this program, I checked out your website and saw a video with Dr. Stanley Appel. We were talking earlier. Dr. Stanley Appel was one of the leaders in the field when I was in training, which was not yesterday. I mean, this was in the early 90s. Stanley Appel was a major figure in neurology. And so I had to look him up. Is this the same Stanley Appel? And yes, indeed. He speaks with authority. I checked out his bio, and he's been at this a very long time, possibly longer than anybody in the history of research of these neurodegenerative diseases. And he is a super smart and dedicated guy. So I think you've got a terrific guy on your team. That's for sure.
Thank you. Dr. Appel was the chair of neurology at Houston Methodist for 50 years. That's unbelievable. And when my CEO, Howard Berman, contacted me saying, Dana, would you like to join my company? We need someone who is exuberant, passionate about this cause to help build the company. I knew Dr. Appel's name because, one, he had treated my Uncle Bill back in the year 2000, and my uncle was living in New York, but was from Houston, where Dr. Appel has, been based for many, many, many years. And, our family said, you've got to go see Dr. Appel. He's the only one that can make a difference, right? So even back then, just like you said, he was well known and demanded. And 2, I had been tracking all of the ALS studies, being the child of ALS. In Dr. Appel's phase 1 cell therapy trial, that was kind of the precursor to the biologics we are now using, the same mechanism of action, but in cell therapy, was the only trial that actually had any true efficacy in stopping this disease. And so when my CEO asked if I wanted to join the company, it was a 100%, this is where I want to spend, my time, my effort, to change the future of this disease. And I think that now being able to do it on the symptomatic space through Coya, I'm hoping that I will change the future for millions of lives, and being able to do it on the pre-symptomatic stage with End the Legacy, I'm hoping that I might change my life in the lives of millions who our goal with End the Legacy is that we hope that we never develop disease. We have to learn how to prevent it. Right.
So let's say there's somebody out there who's listening or watching who has someone in the family with frontotemporal dementia or ALS, and they're interested in getting tested or being part of the End the Legacy, who would they contact?
Sure. Well, there's a few ways to go through genetic testing, right? First, we are trying to make it so that everyone with ALS or FTD gets genetic testing. That's currently not the case, and it's kind of doctor by doctor as to whether they recommend genetic testing or not. We think that should be across the board. Everyone with these diseases, there's 20% of cases are genetic, and the only way we can find out more genetic underpinnings is to have genetic data from everyone. There's really two ways. One brand new one is through Sanogenetics called Light the Way. And they are offering free genetic testing with genetic counselors, all remote. And I highly recommend the team and the work that has been put in. There's been people from End the Legacy who have helped build that program. But another thing that I've been through and I am a big supporter of is longitudinal research studies. Now, there are a few studies that focus on genetic ALS and FTD. And, while research is not necessarily supposed to provide care, I truly think that, these primary investigators are the leading minds working on our genetic variants. And I promise you, they really care. And to go somewhere every 6 months to be checked on, to be updated on the latest happenings in the genetic ALS and FTD space, there's nothing like it. I will warn you that you should not go see a neurologist. There sadly is a lot of genetic discrimination in America, and people whom go to see a doctor, the doctor cannot code their visit any other way other than seeking care for ALS. And then that goes on people's medical records, and that can have a slew of issues. So I do think that, it's either Light the Way or a longitudinal research study for you to ascertain and understand.
All right, just to clarify, I'll put those links in the show notes. And if you're sick, you go to the doctor. But if you're
Yes, if you're sick, you go
well,
to the doctor.
if you're well, there are other ways to get this information and participate. There's got to be some giant database somewhere so that with all this information, so we can find out what's really, happening with everyone who has these genetic traits, who gets sick, who doesn't, and then, of course, why. So it will lead us to a way to intervene to prevent those who are getting sick from not getting sick. And that
Exactly.
seems to be a pretty reasonable, straightforward goal.
I 100% agree. I recommend people go to End Legacy's website. We have a great amount of resources. You can sign up for weekly meetings, support groups, etc. And we just held the first ever conference to craft the clinical guidelines for the treatment of the pre-symptomatic community. And so the goal is that we will be able to meet with doctors before the onset of widespread symptoms, not after, which is currently the only way to do it. And so the recommendation that I just gave hopefully will not be the recommendation that I have to give in 5 or 10 years when those are actually implemented. So we're
Absolutely. It's
doing a lot.
becoming clear, certainly in the Alzheimer kind of world, that treatment should probably begin about 20 years before patients get really sick. That you can identify patients earlier and earlier and earlier. By the time you're really, really sick, it's hard to fix. But if you can start, repairing things and preventing things early on, then there's a chance of having much more effective therapies and understanding genes and what makes them active or inactive is a big important area of science right now.
Yes, let me speak to Coya's efforts in Alzheimer's. Concurrently, while we were doing our academic-initiated trials in ALS, we also had an 8-person study in Alzheimer's that produced wonderful results in terms of efficacy and safety. And we've now kicked off and are hoping to read out data from an 80-person study that was funded by the Gates Foundation and also an academic study. And upon that readout, we were hoping that Coya, if that readout is successful, will then work to bring a clinical trial around for Alzheimer's as well. But we are very, hopeful. And, going back to Dr. Appel's discovery, all neurodegenerative disease has the same driver of inflammation and regulatory T cell dysfunction. And T cell dysfunction is a key correlative to life expectancy in these diseases. And we believe we can do this in ALS, Alzheimer's, frontotemporal dementia. And if we are given enough bandwidth, money, and time, I think that we will find the key link to all of these diseases.
Yeah, very, very exciting. I was at a meeting a while back and met a neurologist, a little bit older than me. And he says, people are always asking me, when I'm going to retire. And he goes, why would I retire now? He goes, we can finally, we see progress and hope for these patients we've been treating for decades, without a lot of impact, but it's now for some diseases and right around the corner for others. He goes, I'm not going to retire now when things are so exciting. I can help so many people.
I can't imagine going, being a doctor for decades in a space like ALS or Alzheimer's, and every single one of your patients dies. You've never been able to save a single one. And then potentially there's a therapy coming that will change the way you treat patients. I just look at the experience that I had with my Uncle Bill, my Aunt Paula, my father. In the end, they were all just taken from me too soon. Coya's goal is to, increase that time of the quality of life that one has with their loved ones. 2 years is far, far too short to comprehend someone's value, beauty, life. And we just hope to take that to 5 or 10 years.
Well, Dan, I think that's a perfect note to wrap up on. Daniel Barvin, I want to thank you for joining me on The Art of Medicine.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wilner. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Before we close, I'd like to give another thanks to our sponsor, locumstory.com, a resource where providers can get real, unbiased answers about locum tenens. I'm Dr. Andrew Wilner. See you next time. This program is hosted, edited, and produced by Andrew Wilner, MD, FACP, FAAN. Guests receive no financial compensation for their appearance on The Art of Medicine. Andrew Wilner, MD, is Associate Professor of Neurology at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center, Memphis, Tennessee. Views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on this program belong solely to Dr. Wilner and his guests and not necessarily to their employers, organizations, or other group or individual. While this program intends to be informative, it is meant for entertainment purposes only. The Art of Medicine does not offer professional financial, legal, or medical advice. Dr. Wilner and his guests assume no responsibility or liability for any damages, financial or otherwise, that arise in connection with consuming this program's content. Thanks for watching. For more episodes of The Art of Medicine, please subscribe. www.andrewwilner.com